What you're about to hear was buried under Iraqi sand for nearly 5,000 years. For most of that time, nobody could read it. The cuneiform on these particular tablets was too damaged, too fragmentary, too strange. Then, according to a team of independent researchers working with Grok earlier this year, the system produced a translation that changed the conversation entirely. The tablets, they claim, don't describe kings or harvests or tax records. They describe a weapon that turned a city to glass, a blast that blinded men from a day's walk away, and a cloud that killed children in their mother's arms. If the reading holds up, it is one of the strangest documents ever recovered from the ancient world. To understand why this matters, it helps to know what we were told the tablets said before. For more than a century, the standard interpretations of Sumerian literature have described the god wars as poetic exaggeration, battles between celestial beings, metaphors for seasonal change, allegories for the struggle between order and chaos. That framing has done a lot of work. It has allowed generations of scholars to treat the more difficult passages as literary flourish rather than historical testimony. The new translations, if accurate, do not dismiss that framing entirely. They simply raise the possibility that underneath the poetry, something more concrete was being described. The tablets in question come from a collection housed in a regional museum, pieces originally excavated from sites in southern Iraq during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Sumer, for those who haven't thought about it since school, was the first literate civilization. We're talking roughly 3100 BCE for the earliest writing, a network of city-states like Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur. These people invented the wheel, mathematics, the calendar, legal codes. They also left behind stories about gods who descended from the sky, about wars among those gods, about weapons the texts describe in language that has always made scholars uncomfortable. Most of the famous Sumerian tales, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis, have been translated for over a century, but there are thousands of tablets that remain unpublished. Many are broken. Many use archaic sign forms nobody fully understands. This is where the AI enters the picture. Large language models have become unexpectedly useful at pattern-matching damaged scripts, filling gaps, and proposing readings that a single human scholar might take years to arrive at. The specific project started, according to the researchers, as a test. They fed Grok scans of 12 partially damaged tablets that standard Assyriological software had struggled with. The results, they say, were not what they expected. The first tablet describes a council of the Great Ones. This phrase, the Anunnaki, appears throughout Sumerian literature and is usually translated as the principal gods. In the standard readings, these gods argue over the fate of humanity. In the new AI-assisted reading, the researchers say something more specific emerges. The council is debating the use of what the text literally calls the terrible weapon of the heavens, or in another fragment, the seven that destroy. A god named Nergal is handed control of this weapon. He is warned, explicitly, not to use it against a particular city because of innocence still within. He uses it anyway. What the text describes next is where people have been getting chills. The researchers quote a translated passage that speaks of a light brighter than 1,000 suns, a wind that carried death without touching the body, rivers that boiled, and birds that fell from the sky already cooked. Those who looked upon the flash, the tablet says, were struck blind. Those who drank from the wells afterward died slowly, their hair falling out, their gums bleeding, their flesh covered in sores. The researchers argue this is not metaphor. They argue it reads like a clinical description of a nuclear detonation and its aftermath, written by someone who witnessed it. It is worth pausing to say what a nuclear event actually does to a human body and a human environment. A flash brighter than any natural light. Yes. A pressure wave that flattens structures in concentric rings. a thermal pulse that ignites flammable material kilometers from the point of detonation. Retinal burns in anyone looking toward the flash. And, in the days and weeks afterward, acute radiation syndrome in survivors exposed to fallout. Hair loss, bleeding from mucous membranes, lesions on the skin. Death rates that climb steadily as the body's ability to produce blood cells collapses. Every detail in that list is medically documented from 20th century weapons testing and from the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Every detail in that list, according to the Grok-assisted translation, appears somewhere in the tablet passages the researchers have published. That correspondence is, at minimum, strange. Now, I want to slow down here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that demands a careful look. Extraordinary readings require extraordinary scrutiny. So what's actually on these tablets, and what is the AI doing to them? Cuneiform is logosyllabic, meaning a single wedge-shaped sign can stand for a whole word, a syllable, or a semantic category. Damaged tablets often leave scholars choosing between half a dozen possible readings for a single line. The AI-assisted approach doesn't invent text. What it does, according to the team, is propose the most statistically likely reading based on comparable surviving passages from the entire Sumerian and Akkadian corpus. It can weigh a single broken sign against every other appearance of that sign in every other known text. That said, probability is not certainty. And it's worth noting that passages describing heavenly weapons and divine destruction are not new in Mesopotamian literature. The problem of Sodom and Gomorrah, the flood narratives, the later Indian Mahabharata with its description of the Brahmastra, all contain language that sounds, to modern ears, a little too much like modern weaponry. Scholars have debated this for generations. Most conclude that human beings have always described catastrophic destruction in roughly the same sensory terms. Fire falls from the sky. The ground shakes. The water turns bad. These are the things that happen when any city burns. Dr. Irving Finkel of the British Museum, one of the leading living experts on cuneiform, has not addressed these specific tablets publicly. But in past interviews, he has warned against reading modern meanings into ancient texts. He points out that Sumerian gods wielded exaggerated, world-ending weapons throughout the mythology. The seven, for example, appears in older translations simply as the seven plague-bearers or the seven winds. A flash of light and a killing wind can describe a volcanic event, a meteor strike, a firestorm, or plain old military hyperbole. Not everyone agrees with the skeptical framing either. Dr. Paul Laviolette, a physicist and independent researcher, has argued for years that ancient texts may preserve memory of real celestial events, possibly including galactic core explosions in prehistory. In his view, the instinct to dismiss every ancient description of catastrophic sky events as pure myth may be costing us genuine historical information. He has not commented on these specific translations, but his broader position suggests he would take them seriously. There is another voice that deserves attention here. Dr. Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent most of the 20th century quietly transforming Sumerian studies into a modern discipline, once wrote that the more time he spent with the texts, the more he suspected his own generation had been too quick to dismiss their literal claims. Kramer was not a fringe thinker. He was the Sumerian scholar of his era, the man who taught most of the scholars, who taught the scholars working on these tablets today. His careful skepticism of his own skepticism is worth remembering when weighing any new translation against the long history of dismissal. Then there's the physical side of the argument, which is where things get interesting. Certain archaeological sites in the region have long puzzled researchers. At Tel El Mukayyar, the ancient Ur, workers in the 1920s documented layers of vitrified material, essentially melted and refrozen rock, in strata that did not match known kill use. Similar vitrified deposits have been recorded at sites across the Near East and, famously, at Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley. Conventional explanations range from lightning strikes to natural wildfires to industrial activity from later periods. But every few decades, someone publishes a paper pointing out that the temperatures required to vitrify these particular materials exceed what a wood fire can produce. Radiation readings at some of these sites have also been reported, though the data is contested and, in many cases, decades old. A Russian-led survey in the 1990s claimed elevated background counts at a site near the Dead Sea. A follow-up study by an Israeli team the following year found nothing unusual. Depending on which paper you trust, the case looks either compelling or thin. The researchers behind the Grok translation argue that their reading fits the physical anomalies. They say the tablets name specific locations where the weapon was used, and that at least 2 of those locations correspond to known sites with vitrification layers. They have not yet published this claim in a peer-reviewed journal, and until they do, the correspondence remains, at best, suggestive. There's another layer here worth mentioning. The Sumerian word lists, the lexical tablets that Mesopotamian scribes used to train students, contain a surprising amount of technical vocabulary. Words for specific alloys. Words for specific astronomical events. Words for weights and measures precise enough to make an engineer nod. Somewhere in this vocabulary are terms that have never been satisfactorily translated. They describe substances, tools, and phenomena that don't map cleanly onto anything in the Bronze Age world. Some scholars shrug and call them archaic agricultural terms. Others quietly wonder if the Sumerians were recording knowledge they themselves no longer fully understood, inherited from somewhere earlier. If you take that possibility seriously, even just as a thought experiment, the AI-assisted translation becomes less outlandish. It isn't claiming the Sumerians built nuclear weapons. It is claiming they described one in terms that match what we now know such a weapon does. That distinction matters. Consider the alternative. If someone in 2400 BCE witnessed a catastrophic event, something outside any normal experience, what vocabulary would they have available to record it? They would reach for the metaphors they had. The sun, fire, wind, the gods. They would not invent new words because they had no framework to know new words were needed. 5,000 years later, a reader with different frameworks might look at that description and recognize in the old metaphors something the original writer could not have named. That is the argument the researchers are making. Whether the argument lands depends on how literally you are willing to read the old poetry. A parallel worth thinking about comes from the Hiroshima survivor testimonies. The Hibakusha, the survivors of the 2 atomic bombings in August 1945, were asked repeatedly in the years after to describe what they saw. Many of them, especially the older ones, reached for the language of their religious and folk traditions. They described demons. They described the wrath of heaven. They described the end of the world in specific terms that read, on paper, almost identically to passages from classical Buddhist and Shinto apocalyptic literature. None of those survivors were confused about what had happened. They just did not have a vocabulary purpose-built for nuclear warfare. They used the vocabulary they had. If the Sumerians did something similar, the resulting text would look exactly like the one the AI is now reading. What does a reading like this mean if further analysis confirms it? On a purely academic level, it reshapes how we approach damaged cuneiform. For over a century, the gaps in broken tablets have been filled by educated guesses from human scholars, and those scholars have naturally been shaped by the assumptions of their era. An early 20th century translator, raised on Homer and the King James Bible, tends to render ancient battle scenes in heroic cadences. A modern AI trained on the full corpus may, at least in theory, be less biased toward any one era's expectations. That doesn't make the AI right. It just means its guesses are different, and different guesses are valuable. On a historical level, the implications are harder to hold. If even a fraction of the Sumerian god war narratives preserve memory of actual events, however distorted by 5,000 years of retelling. Then the story we tell about the deep human past has a hole in it. Something happened that the survivors could only describe in the language of gods and cosmic weapons. Whether that something was a celestial impact, a volcanic eruption, a misremembered battle, or something stranger, it left a mark on the earliest written civilization on Earth. There is also the uncomfortable possibility that pattern matching in ancient texts, assisted by modern AI, will start to reveal more stories like this one. There are, by one estimate, over 500,000 unread or partially read cuneiform tablets sitting in museum basements around the world. Most of them will turn out to be administrative records. But the ones that aren't, the literary and religious texts, have barely been touched in decades. A single motivated team with the right tools could, in theory, start producing revised translations in a matter of months. Whether those translations will be accepted by mainstream Assyriology is another question. Peer review is slow. Consensus moves at the pace of a generation. The scholars whose life work might be challenged by a machine-assisted reassessment are, understandably, the ones who will evaluate that reassessment. That doesn't mean they'll be wrong to resist it. It does mean the process will take time. There is also a broader pattern worth noting. Similar mythological material shows up in other traditions that, on the face of it, had no contact with Sumer. The Mahabharata of ancient India describes a weapon known as the Brahmastra in terms that, to modern ears, read like an atomic blast. An iron thunderbolt, a single projectile charged with the power of the universe, producing a column of smoke and flame brighter than 10,000 suns, rendering hair and nails to fall from the bodies of those exposed. Some comparative mythologists treat this correspondence as evidence of cultural diffusion, the spread of powerful imagery from one civilization to another over centuries. Others see it as convergent symbolism, humans reaching independently for the same terrible pictures when describing ultimate destruction. A minority position argues that something actually happened somewhere in deep prehistory, and that the memory of it seeded multiple traditions before any of them had written language to anchor it. None of these readings is provable. All of them are consistent with the evidence currently available. The Grok translation, if it survives academic scrutiny, will not settle the question. It will just move the evidentiary bar slightly. For now, the tablets sit in their storage cases. The translations circulate in a small community of researchers, independent scholars, and curious onlookers. The vitrified layers at Mesopotamian sites remain unexplained to everyone's satisfaction. The old stories, the Council of Gods, the reluctant warrior, the terrible weapon, the blinded survivors stay where they've always been, waiting for someone to decide what they mean. There is one more wrinkle that keeps coming up in the conversations around this translation, and it is the simplest one. The Sumerians themselves, in multiple surviving texts, describe their own civilization as the inheritor of an earlier one. They wrote at the time before the flood. They spoke of kings who reigned for impossible lengths of time before a great disaster swept civilization clean and forced humanity to begin again. For over a century, scholars have treated these king lists and flood narratives as mythology. In the last 30 years, the conversation has become less settled. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, a massive stone complex built roughly 11,500 years ago, by what the standard model claims were hunter-gatherers incapable of such work, has forced even conservative archaeologists to reconsider the timeline of human civilization. If there was something earlier than we previously thought, and if the Sumerians were closer to the memory of it than we are, then their stories might preserve fragments of information that predate written language itself. That is a large claim. It is not a claim anyone can prove. But it is a claim that is no longer dismissed out of hand in the way it was even 20 years ago. The new translation of the tablets slots into that larger conversation. Whether it confirms anything, or only adds another interesting data point to a long-running argument, is something the next generation of researchers will have to decide. The question left on the table is simple to state and impossible to settle in a single video. Did the Sumerians witness something catastrophic, recorded in the only vocabulary they had, and pass that record down for 5,000 years until a machine learned enough to read it back to us? Or are we once again looking into an ancient mirror and seeing our own anxieties looking back? Probably some of both. The truth, in cases like this, is rarely clean. If anything about this investigation changed how you think about the Sumerian tablets, or about the stories we tell ourselves about the ancient world, that curiosity is exactly what these old texts were written to provoke. They were written to be read 5,000 years later in ways their authors could never have imagined. We are finally starting to read them again. What else is waiting in those storerooms? Nobody yet knows. The shelves go on for kilometers. The tablets number in the hundreds of thousands. And now, for the first time in the long history of Assyriology, there are tools capable of reading them faster than the scholars can file them. Whatever the next year brings, it is unlikely to be dull.